Manic the Hedgehog. Manic is a hedgehog who cannot run fast, and that single fact makes him the strangest member of his own family. He's one of the three lead characters of Sonic Underground, the triplet brother of Sonic and Sonia, raised on the streets by a thief named Feral after Dr. Robotnik split the royal siblings up as infants. Sonic got the speed, Sonia got the strength, Manic got neither. According to the character's own official profile, he possesses no superpowers of his own at all, making him the only one of Queen Alina's 3 children born without an ability that matches his siblings. For a hedgehog, a species built around one specific superpower, that's the equivalent of a fish that can't swim. Here's where it gets interesting. Manic doesn't compensate with training or grit the way you'd expect from a scrappy street kid. He compensates with a hoverboard, a personal vehicle that doubles as a surfboard, and lets him keep pace with a brother who can outrun sound without breaking a sweat. It's a rare admission from a franchise built almost entirely around the idea that hedgehogs are fast by default. Manic needed hardware to keep up with a bloodline that skipped him. What he does have instead is a medallion shaped like a drum kit that can trigger seismic activity on command, and a set of skills that have nothing to do with speed at all: lockpicking, hacking, pickpocketing, the toolkit of a street thief rather than a superpowered prince. He's strong enough to dent a SWAT bot with a drumstick, but strength was never the trait he needed. Manic's backstory explains why he leans on street skills instead of superpowers. When Queen Alina was forced to scatter her 3 infants to keep them safe from Dr. Robotnik, Manic's basket was stolen not by fate, but by an actual thief named Feral, who raised him in the sewers and back alleys of Robotropolis and trained him as a pickpocket rather than a fighter. That upbringing is baked into everything he does. He can pick a lock with nothing more than one of his own quills, hack a computer terminal under pressure, and lift a wallet in a crowded room without anyone noticing. And according to the Oracle of Delphius, the very being who prophesied the siblings' destiny, Manic's drum kit is actually the single most powerful weapon of the 3 medallions, capable of triggering seismic activity and deflecting laser fire off its symbols. The whole premise of Sonic Underground hinges on a prophecy from a figure called the Oracle of Delphius, who foretold that Queen Alina and her 3 separated children would one day reunite to overthrow Dr. Robotnik and form what the show calls the Council of Four. And Manic's entire skill set, the lockpicking, the hacking, the years spent surviving without his siblings, only exists because that prophecy required the family to be split apart in the first place. So the slowest hedgehog in the family also wields, by prophecy, the strongest weapon in the family. Sonic gets to outrun problems, Sonia gets to overpower them, Manic has to outthink and outmaneuver his, relying on reflexes, timing, and a fair amount of theft to survive fights his own body was never built to win outright. Even behind the scenes, Manic got the short end of the deal. All 3 siblings share the same speaking voice actor, Jaleel White, but Manic's singing voice in the band's musical numbers was handed to a separate performer, Tylee Ross, as if the show itself couldn't quite commit a single actor's full range to the sibling who was already missing a superpower. Manic is proof that not every hedgehog in this franchise got the gift the species is famous for, and it's exactly that gap that makes him memorable instead of forgettable. Every other name on this list earns their spot through velocity. Manic earns his by being the one who very definitely doesn't have it. Hit the like and subscribe button to see more videos like this. Leave a comment on which hedgehog you think deserves a higher spot. Let's get back into the video. Sonia the Hedgehog. Sonia is Manic's sister and Sonic's other triplet, and she landed somewhere in between her brothers on the family speed chart. Raised by an aristocratic family after the siblings were separated at birth, Sonia grew up with wealth, etiquette lessons, and a general horror of getting dirty, which makes her the least likely member of the trio to look like a video game hero. She very nearly wasn't a triplet at all. According to documents from the show's own writers, Sonia was originally conceived as Sonic's only sibling, a solo sister meant to headline the series and pull in a broader audience before the concept expanded into the 3-way sibling dynamic that actually made it to air, with Manic added afterward under the working name Edsel. But she did inherit something from the family gene pool. Fan characterizations and the show itself consistently describe her as having genuine super speed, just noticeably less than what Sonic can pull off, the family's fastest and most famous export. Rather than sit on that gap the way Manic quietly accepts his, Sonia compensates the same practical way he does. A personal vehicle, in her case a pink motorbike, that keeps her in the fight alongside a brother who doesn't need wheels to keep up with sound. Here's the twist that makes Sonia more than a background triplet. Her real strength was never meant to be speed at all. She's built around super strength, capable of matching her mother's warrior lineage in raw power, even while trailing behind in a foot race. That's a rare setup for a hedgehog character in this franchise, where speed is usually the entire point of the species. Sonia flips the formula, pairing hedgehog tier quickness with a punch that would make Knuckles pay attention. Her medallion transforms into a laser blasting keyboard, doubling as both weapon and instrument, since the Sonic Underground siblings are, improbably, also a touring rock band trying to overthrow a dictator between shows. Sonia spent her whole arc being the sibling raised furthest from the family's outlaw roots, competent in a fight, but never quite as fast as the brother whose name is on the marquee. Her upbringing shaped more than her attitude towards speed. Raised in genuine luxury while her brothers grew up in a modest household in the sewers, respectively, Sonia trained in karate and gymnastics rather than street survival, which gives her a fighting style built on precision and form instead of raw improvisation. She hates getting dirty, worries about her hair mid-mission, and carries herself with an aristocratic polish that puts her at odds with Sonic's reckless streak, to the point where the two of them clash constantly over his impulsive plans. And unlike her brothers, her design leans more human than Hedgehog, with flowing pink hair standing in for the spiked quills Sonic and Manic both have. A visual choice that quietly reinforces how far removed from the family's outlaw roots she was raised. Her romantic entanglements underline that same theme of a hedgehog operating outside her own species' usual lane, with flirtations and relationships across the show and comics involving an echidna, a lion, and a mink. None of them fellow hedgehogs, none of them particularly concerned with how fast she could run. Once reunited with her brothers, she becomes one of 3 co-leaders of the Freedom Fighters, sharing command rather than following, proof that the group never needed her to be the fastest member to trust her with real authority. She's the reminder that in this family, speed wasn't distributed evenly, and Sonia landed in the comfortable middle faster than one brother, nowhere close to the other. Amy Rose. Amy has been chasing Sonic since Sonic CD, and for a hedgehog whose entire personality is built around catching a faster hedgehog, she's spent 3 decades never quite closing the gap. She's a pink hedgehog with an oversized crush and an equally oversized hammer, the Pico hammer, which she swings with enough force to double as a mobility tool, using its momentum to propel herself forward mid-run. That's Amy's whole strategy in miniature. She isn't naturally as fast as the characters she runs with, so she engineers her way closer to their level. In Sonic Riders, she's classified as a speed-type character, technically placing her in the same category as Sonic himself, the game's own stat system putting them on paper as equals. But here's the exception that undercuts the label. Across most of the actual games she appears in, Amy consistently lands in the same speed tier as Knuckles and Tails, solidly fast by ordinary standards, nowhere close to matching Sonic or the handful of characters who can actually keep pace with him. It's a contradiction the games themselves have never fully resolved, an official speed classification sitting right next to consistent gameplay footage of her trailing the pack. What she lacks in raw velocity, she makes up for in motivation. Amy's default state is mid-chase, hammer in hand, hurtling after a blue blur who's perpetually one zone ahead of her, and that persistence is arguably more defining than any stat sheet. She's also proven in games like Sonic Adventure that she doesn't need to outsprint her friends to be useful in a crisis, using quick reflexes and that hammer to bail out characters who technically outrun her. Her origin story explains exactly why she spent her whole existence playing catch-up. In her 1993 debut, Sonic CD, Amy arrived on Little Planet after reading her own tarot cards, which predicted a destined encounter with Sonic, a prediction that came true the moment she spotted him and threw herself at him in excitement, only for Sonic to not reciprocate at all. That same trip immediately went sideways. At Collision Chaos, she was kidnapped by Metal Sonic, Dr. Robotnik's newest creation, and held hostage at Stardust Speedway until Sonic beat his metal doppelganger in a race to free her. So Amy's entire relationship with Speed started as a bystander to it, a girl who couldn't outrun a robot on her own and had to be rescued by someone who could. She originally went by the nickname Rosie the Rascal, and even her age has shifted around the franchise for continuity reasons, described as 8 years old in that first appearance before officially aging up by 4 years starting with Sonic Adventure. Her signature Pico hammer didn't even show up until Sonic the Fighters a few games later, meaning the version of Amy who couldn't keep pace with Metal Sonic had to wait for her own equipment to catch up before she stood a real chance of running with this cast. By the time Sonic Heroes rolled around, Amy had graduated to leading her own squad, Team Rose, alongside Cream the Rabbit and Big the Cat. chasing rumors that Sonic had been spotted nearby in hopes that beating Eggman herself would finally get his attention. And here's a detail that undercuts her own speed-type label in a way almost nobody notices while playing. Amy actually had the Lightspeed Dash, the same rings-based burst move Sonic and Shadow use, coded directly into Sonic Heroes game files, fully functional and ready to go. It just never made it into the finished product, cut for the simple reason that nobody finished the animation for it, so the game quietly defaults her back to an ordinary run instead whenever a player tries to trigger it. Amy had the extra gear sitting in the code and still wasn't given the chance to use it. Her value has never really been about outrunning anyone anyway. In Sonic Adventure, she's the one who talks a hunter-killer robot named E102 Gamma into questioning his own orders. A moment of pure empathy that has nothing to do with speed and everything to do with why players keep coming back to a character who, by most stat sheets, should be one of the slower members of the cast. It clearly worked. On an official franchise-wide popularity poll, Amy landed in 5th place overall, ahead of plenty of characters who could physically leave her in the dust, making her the single most popular female character the series has ever produced. Amy rose as the hedgehog who never stopped closing distance on someone faster, and the fact that she still hasn't caught him after 30 years says less about her legs and more about how fast Sonic actually is. Silver the Hedgehog. Silver is the hedgehog who technically shouldn't be this high on a speed list, and that's exactly the point. He debuted in the widely mocked 2006 reboot as a time traveler from 200 years in the future, and on foot, by most comparisons, he's roughly on par with Amy, Knuckles, and Tails. Fast by ordinary standards, nowhere near the tier of the true speedsters. Multiple breakdowns of the cast agree on that baseline. But here's the reversal. Silver doesn't rely on his legs the way every other hedgehog on this list does. His real weapon is psychokinesis, the ability to lift, throw, and hurl objects and enemies through pure mental force. And it's that power, not his stride, that lets him operate on the same battlefield as characters who could outrun him in a straight sprint. Silver doesn't need to be faster than Shadow if he can telekinetically fling a chunk of the environment at Mach speed instead. That distinction is exactly why the Sonic Rivals duology exists. The games were built specifically to let Silver go head-to-head with the franchise's fastest characters, using his psychic powers to bridge a physical gap that should, by every normal measure, leave him outclassed. And when Silver gets his hands on all 7 Chaos Emeralds and transforms into Super Silver, every one of his abilities scales up to a degree that makes the on par with Amy baseline look almost meaningless. He becomes briefly one of the most powerful things in his own storyline. Purely through the multiplier, those emeralds apply to a skill set that was never about running fast to begin with. His actual debut story is where that psychic over physical philosophy gets tested hardest. Silver grew up in a future scorched by Iblis, a living wildfire born from a shattered entity called Solaris, and he spent roughly half his life fighting that creature before a shadowy figure named Mephiles convinced him that a specific blue hedgehog was the one responsible for unleashing it. Silver didn't need to outsprint Sonic to try to stop him, he just needed one clean shot with his mind. He and his partner Blaze traveled back in time to eliminate the Iblis trigger before Mephiles' claim could come true. And Silver spent an entire storyline attacking Sonic based on secondhand information, only to eventually realize Mephiles had manipulated him the whole time. Here's the gut punch buried in that reversal. Even after Silver, Sonic, and Shadow worked together to seal Iblis away and Blaze sacrificed herself to contain it in another dimension, Silver's own future wasn't actually fixed by any of it, since Mephiles had already set catastrophic events in motion on his own. All that psychic power, all that time travel, and Silver's signature adventure ends with the mission technically failing on its own terms, undone by forces entirely outside his control. The Sonic Rivals games lean directly into that same tension a year later, building entire race-based campaigns specifically so Silver could compete side by side with Sonic and Shadow on a track, testing whether his psychokinesis could actually make up the physical gap those two straight-line speedsters were built to have over him. It's a strange kind of vindication for a character whose 2006 debut is still widely regarded as one of the low points in the franchise's history. The games built around proving Silver belongs on the same track as Sonic came after the disaster, not before it, meaning Sega had to be convinced the concept was worth salvaging. Silver the Hedgehog is the answer to a question this franchise rarely asks directly. What happens when a hedgehog just isn't naturally quick and decides to reroute the entire problem through willpower instead of legs? Scourge the Hedgehog. Scourge started life as a glitch. His entire design traces back to a palette swap bug in Sonic the Hedgehog 2, an accident nicknamed Ashura that turned Sonic's model green with black highlights, and Archie Comics later confirmed that exact glitch as his visual origin. From there, Scourge became something much stranger than a joke. An alternate universe version of Sonic himself, originally known as Anti-Sonic, who shares every one of the real Sonic's core abilities, including his top-end speed. Before any of that, he ran with a group called the Anti-Freedom Fighters, later rebranded the Suppression Squad, a gang of evil counterparts to Sonic's own team back on his home world of Moebius, terrorizing that world and causing trouble for the heroic Mobius Prime Dimension long before he ever took the name Scourge. For most of his history, that made him a mirror image with a worse attitude. Then came the twist. In a failed attempt to steal the Master Emerald, Scourge absorbed a burst of its power and came out permanently changed, physically faster and stronger than he'd ever been as plain old Anti-Sonic. Moebius even runs on its own version of the Chaos Emeralds, gems called Anarchy Barrels, which Scourge can tap for the same kind of super transformation Sonic gets from the real thing, right down to a matching burst of speed and power. That transformation is what earned him his nickname in the comics, the fastest thing on Moebius, a title he claims outright and one his own dialogue leans on hard, boasting at one point that he's fought Sonic and Shadow to a standstill simultaneously. Here's the contradiction nobody in the fandom has ever fully settled. Despite the title, despite the boasting, despite genuinely matching Sonic ability for ability, sources covering his history are consistent on one point. He has never actually proven himself superior to the real Sonic in a straight contest. He talks like the fastest thing alive. The comics have never quite let him prove it. That tension is what makes Scourge more interesting than a simple recolor. His personal life doubles down on the theme of never quite matching up to the hero he's copied from. Scourge eventually took up with Fiona Fox, a former freedom fighter, who'd grown bitter after being abandoned during an escape attempt as a child, and their relationship became one of the more dysfunctional pairings in the comics, with Fiona eventually leading his own gang, the Destructics, whenever Scourge wasn't around to run it himself. Even his criminal career has a losing streak built into it. After a mutiny among his own men, Scourge ended up imprisoned, stripped of his spines, fitted with a device that suppressed his speed entirely, and nicknamed Snot by fellow inmates who had no idea they were mocking a hedgehog who supposedly ran as fast as Sonic. He clawed his way back to power anyway, forming new alliances and eventually declaring himself king of his own dimension, only to lose that too. And there's a real-world twist that ended his story for good. After a legal dispute between Archie Comics and one of its former writers, Scourge was written out of continuity entirely during a line-wide reset called the Super Genesis Wave, erasing the so-called fastest thing on Moebius from his own universe with a single editorial decision. Even attempts to bring him back outside Archie ran into the same bad luck. In 2020, an independent publisher announced a mini-series built entirely around Scourge, titled Scourge the Speed Demon, and it was cancelled within 4 days of the announcement after backlash over the circumstances of its licensing, meaning the character built around the boast of being the fastest thing alive couldn't even get a standalone comic to the finish line. He's a hedgehog engineered by an emerald-fueled accident to be Sonic's exact equal, wearing the confidence of a champion he's never technically beaten. Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow was built to be Sonic's equal, not evolved into it. He's an artificial life form, engineered by Dr. Gerald Robotnik using the DNA of the alien Black Doom specifically to become what the project called the ultimate life form, and unlike every hedgehog before him on this list, his speed isn't a quirk of birth. It's a specification he was designed to hit. In Sonic Adventure 2, that design shows up as air shoes, hover-soled boots that let him blaze across terrain at speeds, meant to rival Sonic's directly, close enough that the two of them are repeatedly mistaken for one another by characters who can't tell the real hedgehog from the engineered one. That resemblance is exactly why the two of them settled into calling each other Faker, an insult with real bite precisely because it's hard to say who actually deserves the title. But raw speed was never Shadow's only trick. He can channel a Chaos Emerald into Chaos Control, bending space itself to teleport across vast distances in an instant, a power that sidesteps the whole question of how fast can you run by making the running unnecessary. Even his working relationships reflect that engineered origin rather than a natural one. Shadow spends much of his post-Adventure 2 career operating alongside Rouge the Bat in GUN, the very military organization that raided the Ark and killed Maria in the first place, an alliance that only makes sense for a character built to be a weapon and then left to decide on his own who he was actually going to point that weapon at. Get all 7 emeralds and he escalates further into Super Shadow, a form that pushes every one of his abilities, speed included, past what his baseline design was ever built for. Here's the detail longtime fans point to as evidence there's still more in the tank. Shadow wears power-limiting rings on both wrists, and the working theory, backed by his ankle rings functioning the same way, is that removing all 4 would unlock a level of speed Sega has simply never shown on screen. Whether that theory holds up or not, the character was engineered from day one to make people ask exactly that question. The reason Shadow was built at all traces back to a dying girl, not a battle plan. Gerald Robotnik's granddaughter Maria lived aboard the space colony Ark with an illness called NIDS that had no cure on Earth, and Gerald's entire research project, the one that eventually produced Shadow, began as a desperate attempt to save her rather than to build a weapon. Maria and Shadow grew close during that research, close enough that she treated him like a younger brother, despite him technically being a lab creation months old. Then GUN raided the Ark to shut the project down, and Maria was shot and killed while helping Shadow escape in a capsule, her final act being a request that he give humanity a chance to be happy instead of the vengeance Gerald himself chose afterward. That single loss reshaped everything about who Shadow became, an amnesiac drifting toward earth-ending rage in his first major appearance before slowly working his way back toward the promise. He made a dying girl he barely got to know. It's also the reason his speed was never framed as a party trick. Gerald built the ultimate life form to survive Maria's death and to eventually stand against Black Doom's invasion, which is exactly what Shadow did decades later once he finally remembered what he was actually built to do. That history is exactly why Sega built an entire game around dragging it back up. In 2024's Shadow Generations, released nearly 2 decades after his rocky, gun-toting solo debut, Shadow returns to the Ark to investigate a strange disturbance and ends up face-to-face with Black Doom all over again, revisiting stages pulled from across his history while gaining new Doom powers that push his abilities even further than the hover shoes and chaos control fans already knew. It's the character's first time back in the lead role since that divisive 2005 game, and Sega built the whole release around the idea that Shadow's story, unlike almost every other rivalry on this list, was never really finished being told. Shadow isn't fast by accident, he's fast because someone built him that way on purpose and told him to prove it. Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic is the reason this entire list exists, and every hedgehog on it gets measured against him whether the comparison is fair or not. He's been the franchise's mascot since his 1991 debut on the Sega Genesis, introduced as a blue hedgehog whose very name is a direct reference to the nature of sound, a species built entirely around one trait before the first game even loads. Collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds in nearly any main series title, and he transforms into Super Sonic, turning gold and pushing every one of his abilities, speed most of all, past whatever ceiling the base game had already set for him. A transformation the series leans on so often it's practically the default finale for a Sonic story rather than a twist. Decades of games since have tried to put an actual number on exactly how fast that trait goes. The baseline most commonly cited across the series puts him at Mach 1.2, somewhere around 920 miles per hour, comfortably past the speed of sound and fast enough that Supersonic isn't just a nickname. But that number is the floor, not the ceiling. Sonic Unleashed logged an in-game speed value translating to roughly 6 billion miles per hour, a figure that blows past the speed of light by a factor of 9. That same game is also the one that splits him into the Werehog at night, trading raw speed for brute strength and long grappling hook arms, a transformation that only makes sense as a story beat because speed is so definitionally Sonic's whole identity that taking it away has to count as a curse. Sonic Generations went a step further conceptually, having him run through time itself to repair a fractured timeline, a feat that stops being about miles per hour altogether. Here's the detail that separates Sonic from every hedgehog who came before him on this list. Shadow was engineered to match him. Scourge was mutated into matching him. Silver had to build an entire psychic skill set just to compete with him. Every other name on this countdown reaches Sonic's tier through some external multiplier. An emerald, a lab experiment, a telekinetic workaround, a motorbike. Sonic just runs. No engineering, no accident, no vehicle. He's consistently described across the franchise's own material as simply the fastest thing alive. A title he's never needed a twist or a power-up to justify, only maintained it. The live-action films actually gave the "how fast is he really" question its most literal answer yet. In the 2020 movie, Sonic runs past a parked police car on a highway, and the officer inside, a small-town cop named Tom who becomes his closest human friend, clocks him on a radar gun at exactly 300 miles per hour, an oddly modest number for a hedgehog whose games regularly claim speeds past Mach 1. That's still fast enough to blow past every production car ever built, and the films have leaned harder into the extreme since, with Sonic manifesting bursts of blue lightning tied to his emotional state, and, by the second film, generating visible sonic boom shockwaves consistent with speeds far beyond that original highway clip. Compare that to the version of Sonic that's existed in games since 1991, a name literally built around Sonic, the nature of sound, and the gap becomes the whole joke. Even the grounded live-action Sonic still can't help but blow past what should be physically possible. His speed became so culturally synonymous with the character that it crossed over entirely outside his own franchise, most notably when he joined Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Brawl roster as a playable fighter, a crossover that only made sense because the fast one was already Sonic's whole brand before a single frame of that game was ever animated. Every other hedgehog on this list needed something Sonic never did. Shadow needed a lab, Scourge needed a mutation, Silver needed a psychic workaround, Sonia and Manic needed a motorbike and a hoverboard just to keep their family reunions on schedule. Even Amy needed a hammer just to close some of the distance. Sonic needed none of it, and 30 plus years and 4 live-action films later, the franchise still hasn't found a clean way to put a single number on him because the character was never really about the number. He's the blue blur every other hedgehog on this list gets measured against, and the fact that nobody can agree on exactly how fast he is might be the most Sonic thing about him. Where would you actually rank these 7 on your own list? Drop your order in the comments.